Order. The Justice Select Committee is now in session for the pre-appointment hearing of His Majesty's Chief Inspector of the Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate, and we are going to be questioning, as part of the pre-appointment process, Anthony Rogers. We are starting slightly later than usual, so apologies to anyone who was expecting us to be on sooner, but we will get straight underway once we have done our declarations of interest. So could we go around the room, starting with Warinder Just?
I am Warinder Just, MP for Wolverhampton West. I'm a solicitor and Executive Council member of the GMB Trade Union. I also have membership of various APPGs.
Hello, my name's Sarah Russell. I am a member of Usdaw Community and I'm a solicitor.
I'm Pam Cox. My interests are as declared. I would add on this occasion that I did write a report for Dame Vera Baird, looking at the role of Inspectorate, supporting her as OVC.
I'm Josh, the MP for Eastbourne. I don't have any interest to declare beyond what is in the register.
Andy Slaughter, I'm the chair of the committee. I'm a non-practicing barrister. I'm a patron of two justice-related organisations called the Upper Room and Hampstead and Fulham Law Centre, and I'm a member of the GMB and Unite Trade Unions. Tessa, did you have anything?
Thank you, of course. Tessa Mont, I'm the member for Wells and Mendip Hills. I'm a director of Whistleblowers UK, which is a non-profit making organisation, and I am the vice chair of the APPG on whistleblowing.
I'm Ashley Fox, the member for Bridgewater. My interests are as declared on the register.
Thank you very much. And welcome again, Mr. Rogers. I'm going to ask you just a few preliminary questions and hand over to my colleagues. Would you introduce yourself to the committee and briefly explain your background?
Yes, I'm Anthony Rogers. I'm currently, for the last 11 months, the Interim Chief Inspector of the Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate. And I started as a civil servant straight out of seminary in 1989. So I've been a career civil servant since 1989, apart from a period when I actually retired in 2016 and came back in 2018. I've held a number of posts across the civil service since 1989. Been very lucky to work in a number of government departments in Land Revenue, DSS, as was Department of Work and Pensions, Land Registry, and came to criminal justice in 2003 when I joined the Inspectorate for the first time. I came to the Inspectorate as a business management inspector, so I'm not a lawyer, and I left the Inspectorate in 2012 as Deputy Chief Inspector to join the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, as its first head of compliance. The CPS was sick of the Inspectorate telling them things they didn't know, so they thought they could use some of the best practice from inspection, so hence why I joined the CPS. I then became area business manager for the largest of the CPS areas, CPS London, and left the civil service 2016, became a consultant for 2 years. Then 2018 I was reinstated back into the Inspectorate as Deputy Chief Inspector, and have been Deputy Chief Inspector there until I took up the interim post in 2024, 11 months yesterday, for that matter.
Thank you very much. Now, His Majesty's Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate, I think from here on in HMCPSI, is a public body that many people would not have heard about. Could you explain the significance of HMCPSI's role within the criminal justice system?
So the Inspectorate inspects the Crown Prosecution Service statutory duty and the Serious Fraud Office. We got powers in 2013 to inspect the Serious Fraud Office. We're there to drive the improvement of the quality of legal decision-making and casework across both of those organisations. We produce evidence-based, all published reports so that the public, yourselves, the Attorney General can hold both of those organisations to account. We also actually provide recommendations to the directors of both organisations to allow them to drive change. The Inspectorate has existed since 2000. It's our 25th birthday this year, for which I am very proud. And we have driven change and improvement across the criminal justice system, but we exist to actually assess the quality of the services provided by the Crown Prosecution Service and the Serious Fraud Office. I also have a statutory duty to inspect with the other criminal justice inspectorates, police, probation, prisons, and have to produce a statutory programme of inspection, of joint inspection. And I also have the very unique power in my act, which gives me the power to inspect by invitation. So the Chief Inspector can be requested by other prosecutorial bodies to inspect, and we completed last year an inspection of the Service Prosecuting Authority by invitation, and in May this year we'll start an inspection of the Health and Safety Executive Legal Services Division. I will talk about that when you ask what my priorities are going to be for the coming years.
We will. Could you just clarify one point, which is if you are appointed, do you have any plans to take on any professional or voluntary work commitments alongside the role of Chief Inspector?
No, I don't.
That's helpful. I'll hand over to my colleague Pam Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
One of the essential criteria for the role requires you to demonstrate exceptional organisational leadership and ability to develop strategic vision for an organisation. Apologies if this sounds like a job interview now. How does your experience to date demonstrate your leadership capabilities, and could you set out your strategic vision for the Inspectorate? Thank you.
Yes, I can. So my CV, which I think you've had a copy of, shows that actually across my civil service career I've been very lucky to run some very large organisations. So I went into management and leadership very early. I was a generalist civil servant, and I have had posts that have given me 650 staff, 32 locations nationally in Inland Revenue, setting the direction for that organisation. You know, I take it back every time to the values that I bring about public service making a difference. So in terms of what my leadership looks like, it's engaging, open, transparent, honest, but driving people through sort of the values that civil servants, all public sector workers should have. I also, when I was area business manager in the largest CPS London area, you know, I had 600 staff in that role as well. And again, I was part of the senior team, driving leadership as a leader of that organisation, motivating as you do through constant engagement and communication. The strategic vision I have for the Inspectorate going forward is actually threefold, which is I think we need to be a solution to the pressures that are currently in the criminal justice system. Inspection can be sometimes, I think, more about expressing what is wrong and what needs to be fixed, and therefore making recommendations. I think actually inspection can also be about how do we spread best practice. The report you have in front of you, which actually I shared this morning, was published today, shows there's an airy variation, and I think there's something about actually making sure that what is best in certain places is actually spread, and that we use that to help ease the pressures, because the pressures aren't going to be reducing. I also think that the Inspectorate, after 25 years of inspecting legal decision making, has a lot to offer on the back of the Horizon scandal. The public prosecution world looks a little bit to some like the Wild West, which is why I'm very interested to get into using our experience to help those who prosecute, both public prosecutors, those outside my statutory remit, to understand what good looks like, how they can do that. And I also would like the Inspectorate for a while, and you've actually also got a copy of this, our long list consultation. We've engaged with the Victims Commissioner, the London's Victims Commissioner, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, as I would naturally with any programme. But what we haven't really thought through, I think, is what are the experiences of victims, and what should victims be thinking from a public prosecutor or a prosecutorial place, and what should our inspection programme look like? And if I get appointed, one of my priorities will be to start working across the victim space. So I've already started talking to the Stalking Consortium. You know, I will move into that world with much more focus on trying to get the victim's voice into our inspection, because I think HMCPSI has been quite timid in that space in the last 25 years, if I'm perfectly honest.
Thank you. I think victims would find that reassuring, because many do feel let down by CPS and other elements of the justice system. Another essential criteria of the role requires the person appointed to be able to handle the media and deliver challenging, difficult messages. Can you give us an example of how you've dealt with that in the past? And you might want to reflect on the situation with Helen Pitcher recently resigning as chair of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and how that was handled.
So I'll give you an example first. So obviously, being an inspection and setting out findings that are very uncomfortable, because quite often the findings are uncomfortable, evidence-based, non-sensationalist, but ultimately uncomfortable. You're telling people that they need to improve, and you'll see even in the report you've got today, 35% of casework could be done better. That's quite a difficult message for people who are working very hard. But actually, the example of the Calacane inspection, where sort of the three families were let down, they'd lost all confidence in the criminal justice system and the system that they thought was there to help them. That was a very difficult inspection in that we very rarely are ever asked, in fact it's only ever happened twice in the history of the Inspectorate, to look at an individual case. And in that case we had families who'd lost all confidence, and I was leading that inspection. It happened actually as I took over to be Chief Inspector. And what I did in that inspection was ensure that before we did anything, that we engaged the families. I took advice actually from the Victims Commissioner of a way to do it, the best way to approach it. And the messages in that, at the end of that inspection, were actually not messages the family wanted to hear. We found that the CPS had actually made the right decision, that manslaughter, it was a question between expectation and understanding, which was very, very difficult. And as non-lawyers, it's very difficult to understand how your children or father could be killed and not be called a murderer. And so actually, at that, the day of I published the report, I had the families back in and I sat with them for 2.5 hours to explain our findings, what sat behind it. That did not go well with one of the families because they thought we'd let them down, we were part of the system. I think what they did appreciate, though, was the time and also the fact that actually we were willing to call back on what the Law Commission had set out about the second tier between the difference between manslaughter and murder, and there should be a second element in that. And that those meetings are hard, you're listening, you're empathetic, you're doing your best, you're explaining, but you have to keep to the message, and the message was in that inspection that the CPS had not got it wrong. They obviously wanted to hear that, and that was very difficult. Thinking about Helen Pitcher, obviously, for me, in this role, I'm here to drive improvement across the criminal justice system. That's the whole remit of my role in the Inspectorate. Looking at the Nolan principles around accountability and integrity, if I thought I was getting in the way of making a difference or the Inspectorate delivering, I would have to seriously consider my position, because it couldn't be about me. It's about actually what the job is, and now my job is to make the criminal justice system better. And if I thought I was getting in the way of that because of something I'd done, or I'd lost the confidence of the public or anybody, I would have to consider my position. Now, I don't know if that answers your question.
That answers my question, thank you. And the last one from me. You've been interim Chief Inspector for nearly a year.
Yeah.
If you are appointed, to what extent would you change your approach to the role?
I've done a number of things in the last 11 months which I felt I could make the decision on, because actually it wouldn't tie the hands of a permanent appointment. I haven't actually reached out too far into the world of public prosecutions. I've spoken to Whitehall Prosecutors Group about the benefit of inspection, the benefit of assurance, but I haven't reached out to try to, as I call it, cuddle them to get them into the think about inspection. And I haven't gone too far into the world of victims yet. So I think if I'm appointed, I will actually make a move into that territory in a managed and an effective way, with a stakeholder engagement strategy which I'll be helped with by the Victims Commissioner, London's Victim Commissioner, Stalking Consortium and others. But actually, for the last 11 months, I've held off being totally proactive there, because it wouldn't be right for me to tie the hands of somebody coming in behind me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brenda.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for coming here this afternoon. I'm sure you agree that the CPS Inspectorate has to be independent of government. How would you ensure that that happens, and how would you maintain your own personal independence from the government?
Actually, independence for me, having been in the Inspectorate for nearly 20 years on and off, is one of the key roles that has to be. I agree with you entirely. It is absolutely core to not only the Inspectorate, but to what we do and to actually being able to speak truth to power. So, interestingly, there's a protocol between the Chief Inspector and the Attorney General, and that protocol sets out what independence is. And for me, there are two clear red lines of what my independence would be, and I've taken this approach throughout my whole time in the Inspectorate, and this is the line that I would expect everybody to know. So our findings are our own. There will be no debate about what the findings are when we come to publish our reports. We will engage around the evidence. We will take further conversation and obviously listen to what the evidence may be if they think our findings are entirely wrong and the evidence points somewhere else. But the day we come to publish the report and during the development of the report, those findings are independent. They are the Inspectorate's findings based on the evidence, and they will be published as they are found. The other thing I think that's pretty essential for public confidence purpose is that actually we decide when we are publishing the report. I think inspectorates have to be firm with that. And I think in HMCPSI, that's one thing that another red line for me is, I will not be told and I will not enter into a number 10 grid or any conversation about what's the right date to publish a report. We set the publication date and we take it. Now, there are a number of issues like PERDA, which we need to think about. And also, we were publishing a report at the time when Her Late Majesty was dying, and you have to then think about those issues. But ultimately, we would not be being told, because it's bad for government or bad for, the news story, that we would not publish a report. So my own independence sits around those two red lines. I think the problem with independence is, and I hear this a lot, and I may talk about this later, is that everybody throws which feels like a cloak of invisibility around the word. People use the word independence very freely. But actually what they really don't think of is, what does that mean? So my independence for me is not that anything I do can't be challenged, anything I do can't, it's got to be. But actually independence is about where are your red lines, and they are my red lines. And I think the Inspectorate would not go anywhere else in terms of our independence, because we've got to work with people.
Thank you. That's helpful. Can I ask, have you undertaken any political activity during the last 5 years, and do you have any intentions or ambitions of engaging in any political activity in the future?
No, I haven't. No, I don't.
Thank you. And finally for me, have you considered whether there's any conflict of interest that you may have? And have you also considered whether there may be any risk in the future of there being any conflicts of interest with yourself in doing the job that you would be doing?
I don't think there are any conflict of interest that I have. I don't think actually I'm conflicted in any way. I will become a public appointee on this. I'm no longer a civil servant, so that conflict actually falls. And I can't see anything in the future that I would do which would bring that in. Obviously my guiding principles will be null, and I would think about it. I would have to apply, and I'd ask and I'd seek permission if I was going to do anything. But I have no intention. This job will be big enough for me for the next 5 years, rather than think for me. I have been, and I will be looking again to no doubt become a non-exec director of a charity, and you'll see on my CV I've done that a number of times. But actually I would not probably do that in the world of criminal justice. I would do that somewhere else, just to make sure I wasn't conflicted.
Following from your answer, in the very unlikely event of there being any conflict of interest in the future, how would you deal with that? I
would consider whether I felt conflicted, and then I would write to the appropriate channels and discuss it in a way against the expectations that would be set out for guiding public officials.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank
That's
you.
all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Josh Babarinde.
Hi, Mr. Rogers, and thank you for your answers so far. You've spoken a little bit or touched on some of your reflections on how the Inspectorate works. So you mentioned, for example, that over the last 25 years, you don't think that there's been sufficient kind of incorporating or embodying of the victim voice. You've also spoken about a handful of things that are working well. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what works well and what doesn't overall in the Inspectorate, in your take.
I think what works well is that we produce very high quality evidence-based reports which actually people use to make a difference. And when I say that, those that we inspect, the directors and the staff in the CPS, I know use them. I get that every day, quarterly we meet, and I think therefore the Inspectorate actually delivers a very, very high quality product. I don't think that was always the case, and I also don't think the Inspectorate always delivered reports that made a difference to the extent they do, because we now actually think about where the value in our inspection lies. I think our reputation on the back actually of awareness around Calacane across now, not just the CPS and the SFO, is getting much higher, so I actually think we are getting asked to do a lot more work. Interestingly, this week I've been asked by the Albanian High Commission and the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution in Kenya whether we can go and help them develop inspection products, because actually people see us as quite a unique organisation in terms of assessing the quality of legal decision making. There's no other organisation when you look across, so I think our reputation is also very high. And I actually think that the Inspectorate staff are really, you know, very good at what they do, so therefore that's why we deliver that. So I think what we do well is that.
And reversing that a bit, you spoke about Kenya, Albania as examples of where they want to learn some of our practice. Is there anything from those jurisdictions, or indeed others, in the way that their inspectorates work that you feel you'd like to pursue in this role?
Yeah, so actually last week I was in Glasgow looking at the Scottish model of the Witness Gateway. And I think actually, so I was met with my Scottish counterpart in her office last week. I thought my inspectorate was small, but she has only 4 inspectors, you know, which is a very interesting situation. And I think the way that we actually work around, and I'm going to talk best practice in a moment if I get a chance, depending on a question. I think the way that actually we look at inspection needs to focus on best practice. They do that much more. They're trying to set out best practice. They're trying to set out what is the best way of doing it. Now, it's quite easy in Scotland, and I say this not because I want to make it more difficult for me, but they have one police force, they have one prosecutorial function, they have one computer system that works and speaks to each other. Obviously, we deal in a world where there are 43 police forces, more than 43 systems, and one prosecutorial organisation in terms of the CPS. So I do think that actually we can see things that others do, but best practice is one of those things I'd like to start stealing with pride from Scotland and bring here. And I would like to develop that, because in a time of pressure, and I've spoken to the DPP about this, we've got to find a way to take away the area variation you see in that AIP report and say, this is the best way of doing it, this is the most efficient, this is the most effective. But we've also got to work out, how do we get into the inputs? How do we get into the fact that some areas have 5 police forces, not 1. Some areas have 3 different computer systems from the police. And that does drive the quality of legal decision making. It does, no matter what anybody says. All of our reports for the last 25 years show that the inputs can actually have a major impact on the outputs. But best practice is something I'm really interested in stealing from elsewhere.
You spoke about times of pressure. There are going to be many more of those that come throughout the course of your prospective appointment. What do you think they might be? What are those key risks that you think that may emerge over the course of your appointment term? And how will you manage them?
I think if you ask me, do you want the key risks in the inspectorate, or do you want the key risks of the environment of the criminal justice system? So the inspectorate key risks, it's not going to be surprised. The comprehensive spending review settlement will be a risk to the inspectorate. We are the smallest of the criminal justice inspectorates. Today I have 15 inspectors. I have a smaller budget now than there was for the first 14 years of the creation of the inspectorate. We are 50% smaller than we were in 2010. To do a meaningful programme of inspection with further cuts, there is an irreducible minimum. I have a statutory obligation to do CPS, SFO and joint inspection. So we can't not do those. So as we get into CSR and get into that, now I'm not saying I need more money, but I would say a flat cash settlement would be a risk, which would be a big risk for the inspectorate. I think actually public prosecutions is a two-edged source. I think it's a risk for the inspectorate in that people are asking us to do much, much more because they see how good we are at what we're doing. We've had 25 years experience. You know, there are quite a lot of people who would like us to get out there on the experience of Horizon, but that's a risk that we'll have to start saying no, and that actually will then sort of, those expectations aren't met, and I think that is a risk to the future of the inspectorate. And I actually think that wider victim engagement can be, a risk as well, that if we raise the profile of the inspectorate, which I hope to do given my priorities, and then we don't meet those expectations, that could be a risk to the inspectorate. What of course I can do, I'm very lucky, is the Chief Inspector is responsible for developing his inspection programme, or her inspection programme. And so therefore you can pull back on your inspection programme to meet your statutory requirement to a minimum. But I'm not quite sure that's the best way of dealing with those risks. I could be less, I suppose, ambitious in my vision for the next 5 years. I don't want to do that because I think the Inspectorate has a lot it can give. I think we can make a difference. But I could do that. And I suppose what I might do is not jump with my size 13s so quickly into one of those and wait to see what CSR is starting to look like. But they're the risks I see on the back of what we're trying to achieve over the next 5 years, I think.
Well, a final question. It taps into one of the comments that the chairman made when asking his first question. He said that the Inspectorate is not so well known among the British public. Can you tell us a little bit about what your reflections are on the public profile of the Inspectorate and its reputation, and what work you might want to do around those things?
Yeah. It's quite interesting because actually I usually ask my family whether they've ever heard of us, you know, so when you say, and the answer is no. But I ask my family, have they heard of the CPS? And the answer is no. I think what happens is, I think the Inspectorate, unlike the Police Inspectorate, Prison Inspectorate, and even the Probation Inspectorate, because there's very little, fortunately for a lot of people, there's very little interaction with the Crown Prosecution Service, therefore actually, there's therefore even less understanding that we exist. You may have noticed in the last 11 months I've been more in the press than probably most of the chief inspectors have been for the last 25 years. And not because I want to make a name for me, but I want people to understand there is an inspectorate there that is looking out on their behalf, looking at the quality of the service provided by a key service across the criminal justice system. And I think Callacane actually allowed us to raise our profile. I think that was a horrendous case. But in terms of our profile, HMCPSI, that was probably the highest profile moment in the history of the Inspectorate. And I've been, as I say, there since 2003 on and off. And so my reflection is, because people don't understand the CPS exists, they don't understand the CPS Inspectorate exists. And I think actually we have a key role. I would say, though, that actually the last time that the Chief Inspector was called to this committee as a witness alone was in 2017. So it's quite interesting to me that even this committee doesn't take evidence from the chief. I'm not calling to come back if I get the job.
Noted.
but it's quite interesting that the Police Inspectorate is really well known because everybody knows what policing does. The Prison Inspectorate is well known because the reports for the last 30 or 40 years have said it is absolutely awful. They find a new adjective for awful all of the time. And I talked to the Chief Inspector there about that. Probation with STS 40 is much more understood. We are not, and we need to find a way to break through that. Hence why I'm interested in victims' voice. Hence why I'm interested in speaking out when I have evidence to support media headlines on media. You know, I was in the Domestic Commissioner's press release this week around her report. You know, they're the sort of contacts, but that's about raising the profile of criminal justice and CPS in that. So I don't think we're there. I think we've got more to do, and I think a lot of people can help us, including this committee.
Before I bring Sarah Russell in, you mentioned sort of bilateral assistance or advice to Albania and one other country, I think, Kenya. Not talking about those countries particularly, but if that's something you're going to do, are there reputational risks? If you're seen, I think HMPPS have fallen into that problem before, and secondly, even if there aren't, are there capacity issues for you?
There are capacity issues. So we had a management board meeting, senior management team meeting last week, and we've decided to take a reactive. So we were thinking about having a proactive international strategy to spread best practice. On the back of actually our programme and our resource issues, we're now going to take a reactive. So rather than doing a 2 to 3 day programme with both of those, which is what we've been requested, we've offered a 90-minute presentation on, you know, the benefit of inspection, our products. Our methodology is transparent. It's on our website. It's there. So actually we've taken, so on the matter of capacity, we've considered that, and it will be a reactive stance. I don't think we could afford to do a lot of it. The problem is with that, I quite like it because from a development perspective for individuals in the organisation, it's a really good development.
It's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Would you get paid for it? Not you,
We
but
can so if Kenya before COVID, we were going to do it. FDCO were going to pay for it, and we would have got the money to be able to backfill through associate inspectors. If it came like that, we would consider whether it was affordable and achievable. Reputationally, I think there is always a reputational risk that you start working with countries where it is seen to be a risk. But actually, anything that's best practice around the world, I think, UK PLC would want us to do that, government would want us to do that. So, but I do think that there would be some that we would take advice on, whether actually it was the right place to be going, having considered the request. There's some there I think I would not be going if it was requested.
Thank you. Just to clarify something, I think at the beginning you said that you didn't intend to take on any other voluntary roles, but you also, I think, referred to potentially becoming a trustee.
I was a trustee. If I was in the future asked to be a trustee, I would consider it, but I'm not saying I would do it, but I would consider it.
So my question is about the quality of legal decision making. How do you ensure that your staff have the skills and experience needed to carry out the assessments of the legal decision making? How are those done?
All of my inspectors come in to us usually via the Crown Prosecution Service, or those we inspect. So they're all lawyers. They've all got at least 3 years PQE. They are trained when they come into the Inspectorate to do what we do, which is file exam. So file exam, the report you've got in front of you is on the back of the examination of 1,240 files. So they are taught how to turn an assessment that they did actually as managers of looking at quality into a much more deep understanding of quality, which actually is the way we do it. So they are given help and time and support around guidance. We have detailed guidance, that actually report you've got. Each of the 60 questions will have a detailed guidance behind it. We go through a whole rigour of quality internal assurance, consistency exercises, individuals reading the same file, coming together to talk about their findings. Actually, I'd make an offer to the committee. We do have, and I offer it to everybody I meet, a session which we do with anybody who would like to come and see how we read a file, which takes an hour and a half, where we actually take individual, and obviously you're all very welcome to come to this, to see actually how we read it. Because when people think we read a file and make a quality assessment, they literally think, I think, that we look at the legal decision making. We don't. We look at all of the evidence across the file. We look at everything that the prosecutor would have seen and had, everything from the police, which we're very lucky because actually all of the CPS information we have access to, because we actually work off a CPS platform, so we have access to the full case management system in the Inspectorate. Apart from those cases that are locked down for security reasons, we can access any case. And so we work through that case as if that inspector had been the prosecutor against the question set and the guidance. And then that inspector will make a judgment of whether they felt that the issue was fully met, partially met, or not met, depending on what the guidance was. And that then gives you a body of evidence, 60 questions over a number of files, to be able to give you an assessment like you've got in that report in front of you of what we think the quality of legal decision making is by the CPS.
Is that judgment reached within an hour and a half?
No, that judgment is reached within a day and a half. We do an hour and a half because we do 2 questions. When you come to see us, there are 60 questions an inspector goes through. The presentation is an hour and a half for 2 questions. We would take a member of the committee through question 4 and 5 usually, which was the code test met, and what was the case analysis and strategy like. And there are 2 questions in hour 60. That is not reaching an hour and a half. So an inspector reading a Crown Court file gets a day and a half. A magistrate's file, they would probably get 3/4 of a day, so they can read 2 files in a day and a half. And if we're looking at a rape file, they get 2 days to read that rape file, to make a judgment per file.
3 years PQE isn't a huge amount of experience.
It's not.
Does that feel adequate?
It feels adequate in terms of we've been everywhere from 7, 5, 3. What I'm looking for, though, people who are and I say this in actually the job troll in my bit, I want people who are curious, who are lawyers, who are inquiring, and who can ask questions, but also who can have open minds. All lawyers, I've never been told by anybody in my whole time in criminal justice, I've never been told that that person is a bad lawyer. What I've been told is their minds are closed sometimes, or, you know, so I actually think 3 Qs is 3 years is absolutely fine. And actually, if you think about it, our quality measures internally, our guidance, we have senior inspectors and we have a lot of people, we have a permanent ratio and a on-loan ratio. We have enough experience to be able to help people no matter their, some would say that I may be a little bit close to the edge, but I think 3 years is fine.
And turning to the CPS, do you have any concerns about its performance or examples of good practice that you'd like to highlight?
The report in front of you, the area of variation in that report is something that concerns me. I think actually in a national service, to see that level of variation, and this is actually, that report is the second pass. We set a baseline in 2021 of the quality of legal decision making. And we hoped, actually we did the first pass in COVID and just after COVID when things were very, very difficult. And we'd hoped that that would have settled. Obviously since then there's been a bar strike, the pressures are increasing, the backlog's growing, you know, the criminal justice system is under great pressure. But that area of variation is something that actually I think is of concern to me, and obviously I've spoken to the DPP about that. He accepts that, you know, he's got a continuous improvement programme looking at what works best. Our focus on best practice will I think help that, because there's got to be something about who does it best, why do they do it best, and actually how do you then get that across the 43 or the 14 CPS areas. So that worries me. I think in terms of what I see that they do well, I think, and I know people on this committee may disagree, but I think our findings around the changes that have happened in rape since 2019 show me that actually there's been an improvement in, through Soteria, through the national operating model, through the handling. We see better quality of legal decision making in rape cases. Some of that I think is down to specialist police units. But I actually think that generally where the CPS has gone in its journey since 2019, since that first rape inspection, which was very difficult for them, I think there has been an improvement, and I see some best practice there, you know, and I think the difficulty with that is how do you then turn that into what I call volume crime? How do you go from a specialist unit into sort of the more bulk crime, which sounds awful, I'm not degenerating that crime, but the volume crime. But that I do think comes as well as a result of the input. Sometimes I think that engagement with policing is better in those sort of cases. But that is something that we've got to think about, and certainly the DPP and those who manage the CPS have got to work out how to do that. But given the pressures, I don't know how that happens.
Have you finished that? Yes.
I've got some follow-up questions, but if you've got a follow-up question on that specific point, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rogers. I suppose I should declare an additional interest. My wife is a RASO senior prosecutor in the West Midlands CPS. You mentioned at the beginning that you feel that 35% of the casework that the CPS does could be done better.
Yeah.
Have you formed some understanding as to how you will make that better? So how would you seek, or how do you think you would ask your inspectors to improve that 35% casework that you think shouldn't be the standard that it ought to be?
So we don't set the standards. We inspect against the CPS's own standards and obviously legal framework, CPR rules. What we set out actually in our report is you'll see that there's areas that are doing 75% of its casework to standards, got a 25% gap, and some doing it 50%, so that's an average figure. We set out in our first round of area reports on area inspection a number of aspects where we said that the CPS needed to improve, which would drive improvement in that figure. The first was the improving the quality of case analysis strategy. Quite often prosecutors don't actually understand what the case is, how they're going to take it to trial, what the issues are in the case and what they're trying to tackle. We see quite a lot of reciting the facts rather than actually thinking through, you know, what's trial strategy. And so we actually asked the CPS to focus, and they have done quite a lot around case analysis and strategy. And one of the other weaknesses is actually around disclosure, the handling of disclosure, the thinking approach to disclosure. So again, in our first cycle of inspection reports, we set that out quite clearly. And it's not for me to manage the CPS. I don't manage the CPS. I provide evidence for them to hold, to drive improvement themselves. But we have seen some of that landing between the first cycle and that report you've got on your desk. But what we've also seen in the same period is caseloads going up from 80 per prosecutor to, in some places now, 200 per prosecutor. So expecting anybody to deliver quality with that sort of pressure is really difficult. I think everybody I meet in the CPS wants to deliver. They do an amazing job under very difficult circumstances. In fact, in the annual report I published in October, the first thing I said was the dedication of everybody in that organisation trying to deliver in nigh impossible. I've never seen it as bad, and I've been around a long time. But we have set out what they could do, but it's not for me to make that happen, it's for the DPP to make that happen.
On one of the points that you made there, you mentioned that you inspect against the CPSs.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Do you have any input into that framework, and do you think that's the right framework?
So the CPS set their own standards, and a lot of those standards come from so 28 days that papers have to be served. They come from criminal procedure rules. We don't. The probation inspectorate do set some of the standards of the organisation they inspect. We don't. We never have. We don't have a role in that. That's why we weren't formed. We did have in 2003 to 2005 something called the Best Practice Committee, where we adopted the CPS file jacket, because we used to go to 42 areas and see a different file jacket in every area. And we felt the easiest way to get over the natural reticence of some to say mine was always the best was for the inspector to take that file jacket. It was the days of paper. It's now that's obviously, and we did for a while take ownership of some of their processes, sort of the development of the file jacket, where the CTL stamp went on the front, you know, what went on the left-hand tag, what went on the right-hand tag, because we used to see 42 versions of the same thing, all doing a similar job. I don't think that HMCPSI, given its statutory remit, is the right place to do that. I don't think I have resource to do that. But we do inspect against their standards. We do not. There is not one standard that when we look at the quality of legal decision making, that is the Inspectorate's. So when we say that they are delivering a high quality or a quality service, it is against their aspirations. I don't think the Inspectorate obviously have inspectors who know what they're doing and what the standards are, because we have more staff from the CPS, but we don't set the standards. I'm not quite sure that will be the place for the Inspectorate.
What would you think of the suggestion that you are helping the CPS mark its homework against its own criteria? And
well, we're independent. We publish reports that are independent. I think the optic could be that we are helping them, but actually we're publishing independent reports which are evidence-based, which are open to challenge, which all of the evidence is published in the back of the report, including all of the file examination. So actually, I don't think that challenge would be fair, but I can understand that the optic might appear that way. But, you know, I think the way that we present our reports, the findings that we make, the negative findings that we often make in reports, would hopefully set that isn't the case.
Lastly, you led the inspection of CPS actions in the Valdo case, which you've referred to. What lessons can be learnt from that case about the treatment of victims in the criminal justice system?
So it was an horrendous case, and I think the issue in that case, which obviously was outlined in the report, and I've spoken to actually the previous chair of this committee about on several occasions, is the difference between expectation and the reality of the system. I think, as I said actually when I did the media on that, the family's expectations would never be met. I think the CPS didn't help themselves by using the word consulting when they weren't consulting. You know, they weren't consulting in that case. The decision on the evidence is theirs to make. The code is there. It wasn't a public interest decision. It was a code test decision against the evidential base. But they raised the expectations with the family around what do you want by saying we are consulting. I think there's an absolute misunderstanding across criminal justice about the role of victims. I spoke to Sir Bob Neal at length about this, and I've spoken to the Victims Commission at length about this. About actually, we now seem to have an Americanization view of that I can have the charges withdrawn. You know, I hear that a lot when I'm out, you know, I heard it last week when I was engaging with somebody that I want to drop the case, I want the charges withdrawn. Well, it's not as straightforward as that. You know, the system is there. They also think that there's a lot of victims who think the CPS are theirs, like a defence has a defendant has a defence barrister or a brief. They think the CPS is theirs. There's a misunderstanding in that system. And I talked to Sir Bob at length about, you know, sort of, I wonder whether citizenship classes should include trying to actually raise the profile of what being a victim is, the rights of victims. We have the Victims Code, which is very clear about what victims should expect about communication, being kept in touch, you know, sort of what they should expect with regard to victims' right review. But I think there's this disconnect between an expectation and reality. And I think we all, including you, have a role in trying to sort of close that gap. Because Callacane, that was very obviously played out in that case, and that was the learning from that case.
Thank you very much. Tessamont.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wondered how you might judge whether your performance as Chief Inspector and the Inspectorate itself was a success.
At the end of my 5 years, I've thought about this quite a bit actually. At the end of my 5 years, if we have delivered a number of products for public prosecutors to allow them to self-assess, improve their casework and improve public confidence, then actually I think that would be no bad thing. That would obviously be one element. If I'd managed to get a much wider view of victims into inspection through the victim's voice and engaging on a much wider, and therefore people understood HMCPSI existed to inspect on their behalf, as well as for the attorney and others to hold the CPS and SFO to account, that would be also a sign of success. And actually, if I'd been able to work to reduce the pressures in efficiency by bringing best practice into inspection, rather than just saying, this is a recommendation you should implement, I think implementing those three things would be a sign of success. In my business plans, and I will have a business plan with my inspection program every year, I would set a milestone to check whether I was on track to deliver those. And I also think that if I leave the Inspectorate better than I find it, an organisation I love very dearly, then actually I would say that if I left the Inspectorate for the next Chief Inspector to be able to pick up and take it to its next stage of its development, then my 5-year tenure would have been very successful.
Thank you. Can I take you back to the first of those? How will you measure perception of you and your organisation?
Well, I think what would become more obvious would be that people knew we existed, and I would find much more public engagement with us, because I get no public engagement now. None. You know, very, very rarely does anybody ever write. So you've seen my long list. I've written to a whole host of people, and you know, sort of, and I can guarantee I will get 5 responses, which will be the statutory consultees will respond. And so actually, I think what I need to make sure is by the end that I'm seeing a lot more engagement with HMCPSI than I have. And that would be probably for me the first sign of a measure of success.
Thank you. Is there anything else? Are there any other matters that concern you, your candidature, your priorities, and your future term as Chief Inspector, if that comes about, that we haven't covered that you would like to point out to us as a committee?
Well, thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Chair.
There is one area that we haven't talked about very much, which is the Serious Fraud Office.
Absolutely.
So that wasn't a trick question, but nevertheless, it has been going through some difficult times. What are the particular challenges of inspecting the SFO, and what will you be looking for from them?
Well, I think, being honest, I came back in 2018 to the Inspectorate. We got statutory duty to inspect the SFO in 2013. We'd managed to do 1 inspection before I'd come back in 2018. And that was very, very difficult in that the organisation, it takes time to get those that you inspect used to being inspected. It's quite a unique thing. There's also a mindset that it's Ofsted. Everybody thinks inspection's Ofsted. It's actually not, but you know, the principles of inspection are very clear. But we all know teachers who've had an awful time with Ofsted. I think since 2018 we've developed a process and a system where the strategy, the inspection strategy, which will remain, is we'll do one inspection of the serious fraud office a year. They're now getting used to being inspected. I think there was a change of mindset in the serious fraud office under Lisa Rosowski, and since with Nick F. Grave, where actually the sea inspection is helping drive improvement. There was a much more defensive view of inspection prior to that. I think that we are used to, HMCPSI, like everything, needed to get used to inspecting the serious fraud office. It's very, very different to the Crown Prosecution Service. Their cases are much more detailed. It's very easy for us to look at 100 magistrates' courts in the CPS cases or Crown Court, but looking at an SFO case is not straightforward. We cracked that nut this year with the disclosure inspection that was published last May, where we looked at a failed case and a case that was done well, so we could see what was the difference and what best practice could be shared. That was a very long and detailed inspection. It took 50 inspector weeks just to examine 2 files at the highest level, and I mean at the highest level. And 50 inspector weeks is nearly £150,000 just to look at one, and that doesn't count how long it then took us to write the report and do that bit.
You have the levels of expertise you need within the inspection.
We do, because actually what we are, and actually I'm about to commission, or in the long list, an inspection of DPAs, and I've asked an ex-head of counter fraud in the CPS to come and help me work on that, so we can buy in expertise as well. I think the Inspectorate needed to grow some experience, but also grow some faith in itself, which we've done over the last 5 years. And so I do think that the SFO, I think that they have been through a torrid time, but I think I've seen since I did the first leadership inspection in 2018 that they are a changed and changing organisation. As I said to you when we met in October, I think the SFO have got now firm foundations. There is a much more clear view of assurance. There is a much more open view to stopping cases and challenge and accepting of challenge. But it's very difficult when you've been working on a case for 5, 6, 7 years if somebody tells you to stop working on that case and they want to stop that case. But I've seen that mindset change in the last 6 years. But yes, it is one of our, and we will do an inspection a year of SFO, and they were getting more used to inspection. We get more used to them, more experienced, and I think our reports actually show that.
A more difficult relationship just because than with the CPS. And I mean, I think that certainly outside observers who clearly want the SFO to succeed would look for some guidance from the Inspectorate about whether they're doing the right things at the right time.
I think the relationship is on the back of the development relationships of people. I've been working with the SFO now for 6 years. I was responsible as Deputy Chief for the SFO relationship. I think it's a developed relationship. I think I would say my relationship with the SFO is as open and as honest as it is with the CPS. I think they are now accepting that inspection is there to help. They weren't always there. They are definitely there now. And I think Nick F. Grave sees that relationship as essential. It's more difficult to inspect, actually, because of the adversarial nature of the defence more than the SFO. So when we engaged in the failed case, it was, which was the GRMO 2 in the SFO report, we found that actually the SFO relationship and the adversarial nature of the work and what they're up against makes their life so much more difficult. And actually it made our life more difficult in that inspection because the defence wouldn't engage with us. So, trying to get underneath some of the issues, it really quite stark the difference, but I can understand why. But I don't think our relationship with the SFO is difficult. I think sometimes our relationship of getting behind some inspection that I would naturally get in the CPS is more of a challenge.
Supplementary to that, if I may, thank you for setting out your role in relation to the Serious Fraud Office. Does the SFO set its own inspection framework in the way that the CPS does?
Yeah, well, we test against their standards.
Right.
So yes, but the disclosure obligation, the disclosure inspection was against the rules guarding disclosure. They're the standards. So it's not we will assess their guidance and see whether we think it's fit for purpose. But in that disclosure inspection, we obviously use CPR as the CPIA as the standards for disclosure.
I think I'd be inclined to agree with my colleague's line of questioning here that it's interesting that CPS and the SFO are setting their inspection frameworks and something like
No, sorry, if I'm misunderstanding, we set the inspection framework,
yeah.
We set out the questions, we set out the criteria, we set out what the inspection will look at, but we will use CPIA as our assessment of what the quality of disclosure was. Because obviously there are obligations under CPIA. They do not set the frameworks. The Inspectorate sets all inspection frameworks.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you.
Looking for any final questions from the committee. If I may, I have one final inquiry, which is you talked a lot about the Colour Cane case, and said that that's very rare as an individual case. Yeah. Do you think it's going to become less rare? There are not a lot, thankfully, but these very serious cases that raise general points do come up. Some of them may get a lot less public attention, but they are still very important. Do you think that there is a role for you there in the future?
I think what's happened is historically government quite often jumps to let's have a public inquiry, let's have a judge-led inquiry, and I was on Unaroy. That was the last time I was in front of the Justice Select Committee with the issue with the director in SFO. And I think as our reputation has grown, people now, and we deliver, and we're seen to deliver, and we're seen to be, what we are, the authoritative voice around some of this. I think we are being thought about more often as a means to be part of that, rather than jumping to a judge-led inquiry or a public inquiry, where the independent inspectorate can look at that. I think that is right. I think, though, if I'm being asked to do that, and obviously you've got to remember, as the Act set out, that I defines the programme of inspection, it is mine. That's what the Act is. The Chief Inspector sets his own programme. That's why I come out in consultation. That's why the long list. Nobody tells me what to put in. But every time anybody requests something, I'd have to consider, but given our resource, I'd have to take an inspection out to put an inspection in. And that can be a very difficult balance, because I never put anything in a programme that doesn't add value, that won't make a difference. So, we've had this before. So in 2019, I was asked to do rape as an urgent inspection. The Centre for Women's Justice had taken the judicial review against the CPS. The CPS had lost all confidence of rape crisis and many of the third sector. And the Inspectorate was asked to do an inspection. We had to drop inspections to do that urgent inspection. But given the profile, we did that. The Chief Inspector made that decision at the time. I think there are many cases where the Inspectorate could do it. I'm not always sure it's the right place to ask, but it's one place that can be asked. And if it fits and we can do it and we do it well, then actually I think it probably would be incumbent on the Inspectorate to do it. And it goes back to the point of profile raising. It's about, we are here to do what actually we need to do to actually let others hold the CPS and the SFO to account.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for answering our question. Yes.
Forgive me. Apologies for going back to something that we have already discussed, but just for my own clarification, it may be my fault that I have not understood this properly, but I'm just trying to understand the distinction between setting the standards and inspecting those standards. Yeah. So if we have the CPS,
can I give you a very quick answer to this? Can I give you the answer that actually I'd like to give, which is, please come and sit with us and do the presentation of how we inspect, and that will make it abundantly clear that actually how we do it. That obviously the standards that guide the delivery of the prosecutorial quality, be it the, what should be served when, by when, who to, in the process, is set mainly in legislative frameworks, or practice notes or guidance. So if we're going to say that the CPS have met the timeliness of disclosure, we are going to use those. We set the standards. We assess that in a framework. Our questions and our guidance will say what fully met, not met, partially met is against those. If the expectation is that an MG3 by a CPS prosecutor includes full case analysis and strategy, that actually looks at disclosure, has done a special measures application when it should have been done, had thought about ancillary matters. That is their expectation of what that should do. Our assessment will be against that expectation because they are the standards that the CPS have set. But our judgment against that framework will be, have they done that? It is not for the Inspectorate to set the CPS standards, because if I did that, we would end up into territory where we could never get through, which is actually what I set, higher standards or lower standards, because they're not my standards, they are the CPS's standards. But if you came and sat with an inspector and did it, I'm sorry, I've obviously confused the committee, and I'm sorry I've confused the committee, but we do not set the standards that we inspect against. We set the framework we inspect against, we set the guidance, we set the measures, but we do not set the standards. But some of the standards are driven by frameworks and practice notes, some of them are driven by what the CPS think good quality looks like.
Visit sometime. I see how the.
Please do, honestly, please do. You know, sort of my inspectors love doing it, they do.
But your ordeal is over for today, Mr. Rogers. We are going to go to private session now to discuss your appointment. If you want to wait, if we're quick, we will let you know. We'll let you know either way, but feel free to wait or not as you wish.
I will hang around, thank you.
As far as this public session goes, I'm going to close that for today. Order.